Hey there, welcome to the Catching Up with Casey show. If you are tired of chasing buy-in, frustrated by teams who just can't seem to get on the same page, or over the constant struggle of holding people accountable without feeling like you're micromanaging, this is the show for you. I'm Casey Watts, team leadership expert and the host of this show. I specialize in clarity, collaboration, and character, and I help leaders just like you take teams from chaos to cohesion, from frustration to alignment, so teams can actually work together toward a common purpose instead of against each other as though they are functioning in different organizations. Whether you lead a single team or a team of teams, on this show, we talk about strategies that are going to help you create a culture where accountability and autonomy go hand in hand. Now, with all of that said, let's dive into today's conversation and build cohesive, vision-driven teams. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's episode. We are going live at 4 o'clock today instead of 7 o'clock. So you're getting some light into the room that I am in. And you're also going to get some light from the conversation that we're going to have today, some inspiration. And I'm super excited to have our guests, Jenni Donohoo and Glenn Forbes, with us. Guys, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Casey.
Yeah, absolutely. So today's title for the episode is Discover the Enemies of Efficacy. And we're going to be jumping into that in just a little bit. But I want to give you guys a little bit of time to share a little about yourselves. So Jenni, let's start with you. Can you tell our listeners who you are and your aspirations, what you do, etc.?
Sure. I'm Jenni Donohoo, and I work with schools and districts, really trying to improve the quality of professional learning. And that's because when teachers are learning, students are learning. And I enjoy writing and designing and facilitating professional learning for teachers and school and district leaders. And recently, my husband and I, along with our 2 golden retrievers, moved to Florida, which is quite a change for me because I spent most of my life in Canada, where my family is, and it's really cold there right now. So I'm not missing that at all.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you are here. Are you experiencing cold weather in Florida right now?
It is perfect. I don't even want to tell you because I just don't want to do that brag for the listeners who are experiencing the extreme cold.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast, and I think the guest or the podcast host, she said they live in Missouri, and she recently said they were going on a trip to Florida spontaneously because the weather in Missouri was miserable, and they wanted to get to Florida weather. So, okay, Glenn, what about you?
Welcome, Casey, and thanks for having me on. I'm coming to you all from Brisbane, Queensland, in Australia, and it's the last month of summer down here, so beautiful weather down in Brisbane. And I work, Casey, as a school principal and school improvement coach, and I've partnered with Jenni, who was gracious enough to work with me, and we are the co-authors of the book Collective Impact, which is been recently released, and so happy to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, I like I said, I'm so excited to have you guys as well. Can't wait to talk about this book. Can't wait to hear nuggets of gold from you guys. But let's get real, okay? I want to ask some this or that questions and really get to know you on a personal level. So, Jenni, we're going to start with you. this or that, coffee or tea?
Definitely coffee.
Okay. Tell us what kind of coffee. Is it just black coffee, or do you go like, you take it to another level kind of coffee?
I like it mild, so I'm not a huge Starbucks fan. I find it's too bold, and I just like it with a little bit of cream.
Okay, pretty simplistic. And let's ask you a different question, Glenn. Would you rather? This is an interesting question considering what we just talked about. Would you rather always be a little too hot or a little too cold?
A little too hot.
Yeah,
for sure. And living in Queensland where we live, that's just how it is. It's always just that little bit too warm, but that's the way we like it down here.
Yeah.
Plenty of sunshine, plenty of good weather. A little bit too hot, I'll take that, thanks.
You don't have to brag, it's fine. I'm over here in Texas where it should be warm, and it is definitely not right now. Jenni, here's a leadership question, and because this show is all about building cohesive, vision-driven teams, I like to ask this or that questions related to team leadership as well. Do you prefer handling team conflict head on or letting things settle before stepping in?
That's a good question. I think it might depend on the situation and your relationship with the people. So I can't answer that straight up. I'd have to really think about the situation, what the conflict is. You know, it might be something that really needs to be addressed immediately, depending on the severity of it. And so it's so contextual. I'm sorry.
No, it really is. And here's what's so interesting. And this is why I love these questions and why I start with two like kind of personal questions and then go into leadership. Typically, our personal questions, people can, you know, like they have an answer fairly quickly, but the leadership ones, almost everyone says, it kind of depends on the situation. But it's always interesting to get the perspectives. Glenn, go ahead, Jenni.
Oh, I wasn't going to, nope.
Nope, you weren't going to say anything. It was me hearing things. Glenn, would you rather lead a brand new team where you can shape the culture or take over an established team that needs turnaround?
Oh, such a good question. I feel a brand new team, and I chose that because I just think setting the norms from the beginning, there might be a better chance of getting some immediate success. A turnaround team. What a challenge! I mean, a big challenge. I wouldn't shy away from the challenge, but I think in this question, the brand new team is what I think I'd prefer.
Yeah. I think I'd have to join you there, but there is something about the challenge of, you know, the excitement behind the challenge of taking on a team that needs that improvement. You guys have written the book Collective Impact. It has recently been released, so it's ready for people to purchase. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I want to ask you what inspired you to write this book and why teacher efficacy is such a critical issue right now.
I'll start, Glenn, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
I think we were both inspired by the challenge of synthesizing the research on the things that derail school improvement. And we were inspired by the challenge of identifying some research-based kind of strategies, like the real practical things that leaders can do to combat deficit-based thinking, or, you know, those undesirable beliefs that sometimes sneak up and control the narrative, both the spoken narrative and the silent one that often goes on inside our heads. Those beliefs that get in the way, that become obstacles to the work. When Glenn and I met and began to collaborate, it was obvious that we both enjoyed the challenge of writing and presenting the ideas in a way that's accessible and really practical to our audience.
Yeah. Glenn, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Casey, just to build on that, I work in a school each and every day, so have a real deep understanding of how challenging it is to build and maintain high levels of collective efficacy. And I guess the goal with our book was to help school leaders identify those enemies within their context, but then give them really practical steps that they can take to overcome the barriers to building belief in their school.
Right. Yeah, it's one thing to know what collective efficacy is, which is already challenging, I think, for people to wrap their brains around. But it's totally another thing to understand what are the strategies we can put in place to build collective efficacy after we have a really good understanding of the term in and of itself. In the book, it's fascinating to me because you identify 12 enemies of teacher efficacy. 12 sounds like so many, and I'm so interested to know which ones you see as the most common in schools today.
Such a good question, Casey. And one of the most enjoyable parts actually of working on the manuscript was the research that Jenni and I completed to create the 12 enemies of efficacy. And Now, originally, this wasn't our idea. This was an idea from our friend and colleague Tommy Thompson. So shout out to Tommy for creating that concept, the enemies of efficacy with Jenni. And I guess for me, it's a tricky question to answer because context is so closely linked to collective efficacy. And for some schools, what might present as a barrier just simply may not be an issue in another school. And I guess what's important for school leaders is to have a general awareness of the enemies of efficacy, and then to, I guess, dive a little deeper and figure out what enemies might be at play in my school or with my teams. And we'll talk about some of the enemies today. We won't go into all 12. The readers will have to unpack that themselves, but we'll give you a little taste of what's to come. Jenni, what do you think?
Yeah, Glenn, you're right. And what we do is we encourage readers not to read the book straight through, but to review the contents and select the enemies that most resonate with them based on their current situations in their schools. I think that they're all common in schools, but we selected them because our research and experience demonstrates that they impact efficacy. For example, uncertainty is one of the enemies, and we cite research that concluded that when teachers are uncertain why decisions are made, it weakens their efficacy. So we really try to be explicit and select them based on the research, but we also focus on practical strategies to address each enemy.
Yeah. And I can imagine too that makes your book so much more approachable. Very few people, I think these days, I can include myself in this group, but very few people feel like they have the time and energy, especially the people who are working in schools who need this content. They feel like they don't have the time to put forth as much energy and time as it takes to read through an entire book front to back. And I'm guilty of purchasing a book, so excited about reading it, have all intentions of reading it, but it just gets added to my stack. Now I will reference it, but I don't always read front to back, and I have to have accountability for that. So let me ask you this in reference to that. Would you encourage people to read this book with like-minded colleagues and or their leadership team and or their staff? Like, who do you envision reading this book?
I kind of think all the above. I don't know. I saw Glenn kind of nodding too as you were listing different groups. I could see it definitely being a great resource for a leadership team. And when we wrote it, the editors, they were wonderful at Solution Tree, really encouraged us to think about that and narrow the audience. Originally, we were looking at a broader audience of any educator, and I still think it would appeal to every educator. And we didn't want to use the term school principal because we do think instructional coaches and teacher leaders is very applicable to anyone. And we also believe that every teacher in the system is a leader. So I think it would appeal to any educator.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that wholeheartedly. When you were talking about one of the enemies as being uncertainty, it really, really spoke to me because obviously that's what my entire content is bringing clarity to your organization. Because my experience as well in schools where there is limited or no collective efficacy present, most of the time what I'm seeing is there's just so much uncertainty, which does such a number on us professionally and personally. So yeah, that's awesome. Tell us about this key message in the book. You talk about shifting from blame to feedback. I want to know a little bit more about that and then how leaders can help teams make that shift.
Sure. I'll take the lead on this one. We talked about blame in relation to the attribution bias. That idea that poor outcomes are the result of a lack of parental support or disengaged students, for example. And by placing blame or attributing blame to external circumstances, it helps to protect our professional identity. Like it's really something we all do. We're all guilty of that for good reasons. Sometimes we blame the system, and sometimes we blame other teachers. And what we do in the book is we really try to encourage school leaders to counteract the blame game through feedback. And we share ways that they can provide efficacy enhancing feedback. We really draw out a couple things. We draw upon the work of Stone and Heen in their work on feedback and make the distinction between coaching feedback and evaluative feedback. And we help the readers identify strategies for separating those two and normalizing coaching feedback so it becomes more of an everyday occurrence. And we also provide examples of the kinds of feedback that really help teachers realize the positive outcomes of their efforts and the strategies that they're using in their classrooms. We really want them to see that direct link between what they do every day, the hard work and extra effort and time and energy, the strategies they utilize. And through feedback, we want school leaders to use that feedback to help make the link between teachers' efforts and student outcomes really explicit. We really want to empower educators to see how impactful they are and how impactful they can be.
Yeah, and those mastery experiences that you are building with that feedback just can't be beat. There's nothing like it in creating that collective efficacy, but also just building capacity in your people. Glenn, I'm really curious because you wrote this book while you were practicing things on your own campus. What kind of impact did that have on you and your campus? I'm kind of going off script here a little bit, and my listeners are totally, I mean, they understand that and they know it's going to happen in every episode. But I'm just so fascinated by how it could impact you and your staff as you're writing it.
Yeah. And Casey, you're exactly right. I was writing this book whilst working in a school, and what a perfect testing ground to try out some of those ideas that we were putting into place in the manuscript. And what was equally beneficial was that I had an expert coach in Jenni guiding me through some of the challenges that we might face at our school. And Jenni actually visited our school in Brisbane and spent some time with our team and our other and leaders from other schools. So it was great. Great to have that ability to think about an idea, write about an idea, and then test out the idea immediately. And Casey, you actually mentioned uncertainty before, and part of the work that you do is about creating clarity. We actually introduce uncertainty as an enemy of efficacy. So you've obviously done your homework there. You've picked out one of the 12, and it'd be actually fascinating to know what enemies the listeners to your podcast could already identify in their context.
Yeah, that would be so fascinating. So listeners, I'm going to challenge you to respond to this. You can put it in the comments on this YouTube video, or you can respond via email, the comments on the podcast. We would love to hear that. That would be fascinating to hear. Yeah. And I have done my research on that, and I also have experienced it. So, and that's just so much more. It is as valuable as doing the tangible physical research. But yeah, so that's awesome to hear, Glenn. Thank you for sharing that. Psychological safety, and it sounds like this is just, I don't want to use the word common sense, but it works so well with what you guys have already said that it makes sense that it's a theme in your book. So what does psychological safety have to do with this idea of the enemies of collective efficacy? What does it look like in practice?
Yeah, Casey, that's such an important concept. And I'm glad that you've identified this point. In one of the chapters, Jenni and I highlight judgment as an enemy of efficacy. Put simply, when people feel judged, they hide their true selves. And as a result, they're less likely to feel that they can develop the trust needed for high levels of collective efficacy. And you can imagine how reluctant a team member might be to share their thinking in a culture where they feel their opinion could be judged, laughed at, or ridiculed, or a culture where people might be talking behind their back or behind the scenes. And I guess the challenge for leaders is to create the conditions where efficacy can flourish.
Hmm.
And to do this, we drew upon the work of Amy Edmondson, who coined the term team psychological safety. And this is where the school climate is one where people feel comfortable expressing themselves and being themselves, being their true selves. And this type of climate is really critical for cultivating collective efficacy. And when people have psychological safety at work, they feel comfortable sharing concerns and mistakes that they may make without fear of embarrassment or retribution. And we guide readers to build an understanding of the different types of communication strategies that are necessary to build psychological safety, the individual preferences that people may have and that people bring to a diverse team. We talk about modeling the norms for collaboration, and Jenny writes a beautiful piece about that. And we talk about the ways to productively share feedback in a non-judgmental way. So that's some of the little things that we delve into in chapter 5, psychological safety over judgment.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I got caught up as you were talking and just wanting you to say more and more. You ever have those times where someone's talking and they finish and they're expecting you to say something, but I'm like, I'm just processing everything you said. But here's my question to that, because, and I know I mentioned this earlier about, your work with your school as you're writing this book. How were your teams like with that, and with that psychological safety in mind? How were your teams impacted? If you noticed a difference in them?
Yeah, and I guess being relatively new to the school, so I've been at my school for about 2 years now. I guess we've seen a maturing of the levels of psychological safety within our team. So,
Mhm.
whilst once we were a little cautious around potentially how we treated a sensitive topic, we've now reached that stage of team maturity where we can lay anything on the table, knowing that anything's up for discussion. And we'll discuss and debate potentially somewhat controversial issues, but
Mhm.
we've now reached that stage where we feel as though we've matured as a group, and some of
Yeah.
those early hurdles have been worked through, and we're confident that as a group we can address anything, work through any challenge, and come out um, come out the other side as a stronger team and more mature
Mhm.
team,
Mhm.
despite sometimes actually vehemently disagreeing
Yeah.
with the ideas and opinions of the other team members. Our levels of psychological safety and team safety, I feel, have matured, Casey. We're in a good spot.
Yeah. It's so interesting to my dream for schools, anywhere of any kind, is that they would start the school year focused on, yeah, I know that there has to be time spent on curriculum and logistical things and procedures and processes, but I would love to see more schools putting their time and effort into thinking about the self and social awareness skills um, that could benefit their teams in the long run if they spent time at the beginning of the year really understanding, like, what are our native geniuses? In what ways do we process information? What do you need from your team, both intellectually and personally and emotionally? Like, how are we getting to know each other in a way that allows us to spark the intelligence in other people and multiply our intelligence, and function collaboratively? But instead, what I find often happens is that faux collaboration where we assume that where two or more people are gathered, true collaboration is happening, and it often is not. So yeah, I love that your focus in the book is, yes, collective efficacy and the enemies of collective efficacy, but also a foundation of psychological safety. But that takes time and effort and energy and intention. Let me ask you guys about compliance versus commitment. We hear so often when I hear a lot of people talk about collective efficacy, and I think sometimes people have the misconception that that's when people buy into something. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about compliance, buy-in versus compliance versus commitment.
Well, that is one of our chapters, and one of our enemies is compliance. And so, how do we get to that commitment? And we feel, I'm sure everybody listening would agree with this, the reason most people get into this field of education is because they want to make a difference for students. When we talk to teachers about why they stay in the profession, their reasons are often because they're invested in kids and they want to do what's best for their students. That's really their sense of purpose. So the strategies that we identify for garnering commitment are really just about tapping into educators' sense of purpose, sparking that sense of purpose. I'll just share one specific strategy that we offer, and that is highlighting a gap. And we experience this in our work in the field. Like when we saw one time, I'll give an example from a team in San Jose, California. The organizers shared some data with the teachers that the teachers had never seen it presented in such a way before. It was math achievement scores over 5 years, but the organizers disaggregated the data, and they had one example that showed on the graph non-Latinx students and then the results from Latinx students, and there was quite a discrepancy. And I remember listening to teachers' conversations as a result of highlighting that gap. They had no idea that there was such a gap. And instantly, they wanted to do something about it. It was upsetting to them. And so by sparking that sense of purpose of why we get into this profession and just that simple strategy of presenting that data in a way that highlighted that gap, people were ready to move from compliance to commitment.
Yeah, that's awesome. When you think about like teachers and highlighting the gaps and then that collaboration that has to take place after highlighting the gap, I think sometimes that collaboration can feel forced or it can feel ineffective. For example, I hear sometimes teachers that have said, why are we having this pointless meeting? Why can't I go back to my classroom and do my thing, get lesson plans ready, copies, all of that, which is understandable because they want and need time. But that collaboration can feel as though it's purposeless. So how can leaders move their teams from that isolation to that true interdependence where not only are we highlighting the gaps, but we're working together to solve those problems?
Glenn, is it okay if I take a quick lead on this?
Go for it, Jenny.
Okay. When you talk about that idea of interdependence, we love the work of Judith Warren Little, who was the dean at the Faculty of Education at the University of California at Berkeley for many years. Her research interest has always been to what degree do teachers out of class collaborations account for positive consequences in the classroom. And she says that felt interdependencies in teaching are few. Teachers don't feel interdependent upon each other. Isolation becomes that enemy of efficacy. And the reason I don't want to get too researchy, but there is a meta-analysis that demonstrates that the relationship between collective efficacy and performance is maximized the more interdependence there is amongst team members. So we know this is an important element for teamwork and for teachers to want to collaborate. So how do you increase interdependencies amongst teachers or even school leaders, right? We could talk about that at any level in the system. So in the book, we talk about interdependent goals. We talk about structuring interdependent tasks. But another simple strategy for increasing interdependence is what Judith Warren Little refers to as extending an invitation to say more. In her research, a lot of qualitative work, right? Listening in on teachers' conversations and PLCs and collaboration. And she has noticed that when a problem of practice is revealed one of three things usually occurs. It gets ignored, it gets joked about, or it gets deflected.
Mm-hmm.
And when it is noticed, it gets normalized as an everyday and expected shared problem of the classroom. And what she says is one simple strategy that helps shift the conversation to develop in a rich way. It's the mark of a learning conversation, is that simple strategy of extending an invitation to say more. The
Yeah.
nature of the problem becomes more unpacked. The conversation yields more than a quick fix, and it helps reduce isolation and promotes joint problem solving and greater interdependence.
Mm. I get chills, first of all, that you mentioned Judith. I call her by her first name.
Yeah.
In my mind, we're friends. I also love how you talked about that, the isolation and the term or the phrase just asking them to say more, which is so powerful, such a great coaching strategy. But it's so funny you mentioned this, because this morning I was thinking about silos. Like, one of the keynotes that I give often is Move Beyond Silos is the title of it. And the whole idea is, how do we break down silos that we're experiencing in our roles in education because we unintentionally create silos for students. But this morning, I was thinking, do we even know that we are functioning in silos most of the time? Like, and I would probably argue that a lot of people don't even know that they're functioning in silos because they haven't experienced anything different than that. They haven't experienced the interdependence. And yeah, so what are your thoughts on that? I would love to know any sparking thoughts that you have based on that.
Well, what you make me think of, and then Glenn, I'll include you to join in or chime in. But what came to my mind, Casey, is that the work of Judith Warren Little and her seminal article, "The Persistence of Privacy in the Teaching Profession," is more than 34 years old now today. She wrote that article about teachers working in silos 34 years ago, and it's still so relevant today. She describes a taxonomy for examining work and describes joint work as that true interdependence, but I haven't seen it in many places. Now, don't get me wrong, it is happening in some places, but 34 years later, we still see a lot of silos.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Glenn,
Did
what do
you
you
have
think?
something? Yeah.
I would just add to that, Jenny, if collective efficacy is about building that shared belief, then that's about developing a shared understanding of the issue, and then following that, it's then about shared action. And
Mm-hmm.
shared action, the key word there is shared. It's not an individual step or someone working individually. It's that shared action, and to do that, collaboration's key. Now, collaboration isn't, collaborative teams doesn't mean high levels of collective efficacy. Collaboration is a precursor for collective efficacy, but it's beyond that. It's more complicated than that. It's building that shared belief through shared understanding, but then shared action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I
And
think
that simply can't be done alone.
Glenn, you make me think of the importance not only of, you said shared understanding, shared belief. I think shared responsibility becomes
Yeah,
really
that's a great
important.
one, Jenny.
Yeah, we talk about that through that interdependent goal setting. That's the purpose of those interdependent goals. They imply collective action and shared responsibility. And so we've got to get to, they're not your students and my students, but they're our students.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm reaching back here because I have this book called Wiser. Have you guys?
I have that too. I could probably pull it off my shelf. It's right behind me.
Yeah, some of the things that Judith Warren Little talks about really makes me think about this, like the cascade thinking or polarizing. And it really is so fascinating, mind-boggling, but also not surprising to me. I know those sound incongruent, but that we are still struggling with this issue, and it seems like the needle is just not moving at all sometimes. Why is that? Is it because it is such complex work because humans are such complex people?
That's a good wondering. You just made me, and it's in relation to that question you just asked, but thinking of the book Wiser and the work of Judith Warren Little, I also think of Andy Hargraves, of course, in his work, and he coined the term contrived collegiality.
Mhm.
And we see like that's what you're getting to, that idea of how do we get beyond that.
Right.
And I think part of it for me is when we do see the results from our collaboration, when we see that it's making a difference, that's that collective efficacy. And we can move beyond contrived collegiality to get to that joint work.
Yeah. In my book, I talk just a teensy little bit about collective efficacy. Of course, how I could not ever not mention that in my book. But one of the ideas that I throw out there for people to chew on is just kind of considering that when you get to a point where you've reached collective efficacy, you almost can sense an even if culture. Like, I am dedicated or committed to this work, even if things get bumpy, even if I'm a little uncertain about what's going to happen next, even if I'm not really excited about this initiative we're about to take on. I'm still dedicated and committed to it because I know the purpose, and I'm committed to my team, and I'm committed to our team making a difference in the lives of our students. But it's much easier said and thought about than actually done.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one last question for you guys. Actually, two last questions, but this one is really related to this content. What one small but powerful step could a leader take tomorrow to start building collective efficacy in their school? Speaking of it, it's easier said than done. What's a step that people can actually take?
Casey, great question. And this is exactly why we wrote the book. By introducing the 12 enemies of collective efficacy, we then introduce 36 micro moves to help readers overcome the enemies within their context. And the goal was to arm the readers with some small but really impactful steps that they can take in their context immediately. And one of my favorite micro moves comes from chapter 4. This chapter is titled Positivity Over Negativity. And this micro move is leveraging the power of the narrative. And it's a quick and simple way to capture a starting point. Now, as a team, the idea is that in 100 words or less, you describe your collective efficacy story. Now, this idea came from one of our friends, Dr. Christine Anderson, a wonderful educator from the Chicago area. And the challenge is to spend time describing your narrative, your collective efficacy story in 100 words or less. So you need to be really succinct and clear. And the questions that are helpful to answer is, how will you grow collective efficacy in your school? What are the obstacles that you might need to overcome? What are the even if moments, just to use your phrase there, Casey? What are the even if moments that might happen where we still know that as a team, as a collective, we've got each other's back, and we can work our way through this no matter what, no matter the size of the problem. And how do people see themselves in the narrative? How do people see themselves in the collective efficacy story in their context? And I guess by doing this, by laying this task out onto the table, you'll be starting a conversation about collective efficacy in your context. So if it's a new concept for you, this could be one small but really powerful way a leader could start the collective efficacy conversation in their school.
Nice. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. What would you hope that our listeners, if they could take away one thing from this episode, what would you hope they take away from this episode? And Jenni, I'm going to start with you. And then Glenn, I'm going to ask you the same thing.
Okay.
What's one thing that they could take away? I hope that listeners take away the idea that they can overcome the enemies of efficacy. They can shape environments within their schools where everyone shares the belief that individually and collectively, they have the capability to impact positive change. I want leaders to know that they have the power to do that. That is something that they can do in their schools.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, in order to make that shift, you have to first know the enemies that you are up against, which is why this book is going to be so beneficial to grace your shelves. Glenn, what about you?
It's a great question, Casey. And for me, the power of the book is in the title, collective impact. That I feel is the key to success. This isn't a solo adventure or a one-person leadership story. The key takeaway for me is how you can lead to achieve collective impact. And that's the impact achieved beyond just simply one person working on their own. It's the power achieved through the collective. And you used that term before. How do we multiply our intelligence, or how do we scale up collaboration? And this book, I think, gives some really practical ways to do that.
I love it. It has not come in yet, but you better believe it's going to be on my shelves. But this sounds like one of those that I'm not going to be able to just put down and say, I'm going to read that at some point, because it sounds like it has so many approachable, applicable things that can be beneficial to anyone who leads on their campus. Even that 360-degree leader that is a classroom teacher. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining this episode. Tell our listeners where they can find you beyond today's episode.
I'm on Instagram, and also they can find me at jennidonohoo.com.
Okay. And Glenn?
And Casey, Casey, our book is available through Solution Tree. It's also available on Amazon. I'm going to visit Jenni really soon. So I'm coming over to the United States in April to spend some time celebrating our work together. And looking forward to catching up with Jenni over in the States.
Awesome. Well, Jenni, I expect you to post some pictures while you are celebrating.
I will.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for joining. Listeners, we will catch you next time. I would love for you to share what was most useful for you from today's episode. Bye, everybody. Hey there. Thanks for joining this episode. I would love for you to do me 3 solid favors before you head out. Number 1, subscribe to this show. I've got a lot of great guests and content coming up, and I don't want you to miss any of it. Number 2, share this show. Share it with your like-minded colleagues and friends and those leaders who are eager to build cohesive, vision-driven teams. And finally, connect with me on all the social media platforms. You can find me at Catch Up with Casey on Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Until next time, go off and create teams that leave people feeling inspired, empowered, and eager for more each day.